A good riff is like a good baklava. It has a lot of different little layers that on their own aren't that interesting to taste, but when you combine them, they create something that is greater than the sum of their parts. So in today's video, I want to go into what makes up those different layers. I'm going to do that by demonstrating how to make like a regular kind of gent metal style riff, but I hope that you can see that these tools can extend much beyond this. Just by layering different concepts, you'll be able to take your composition to the next level, create something that you're proud of, and something that is interesting to listen to. Before we get going, if you appreciate what I'm doing on this channel, then feel free to check out my Patreon and become a subscriber there, or you can always give me one-time donations at my Buy Me a Coffee page. Every little bit helps to go support the channel and keep me going, making this content for you guys, for free. So the first step before we actually start constructing our riff is to decide on our base layer subdivision. That means, are we going to be using triplets, 16th notes, or something else when working on this riff? So I've decided just to keep it relatively simple, we're going to stick with 16th notes, and that will also make it so that this rhythmic grid sheet will be easy to line up with whatever we write. So once we are done deciding that, we can talk about our first layer of our rhythmic baklava here, and decide on some overarching rhythmic structures, or the big rhythms. Now what I like to do to create something interesting that's going to get you right away from doing any basic 4/4 kind of stuff that you're going to hear regularly and doesn't feel that creative, is to use some odd numbers. So just as an example here, we can just throw out some random odd numbers and see what we can do with it. So maybe I like using 5s and 7s because they're quite interesting when over 4/4. So how about we do 5, 7, 7, maybe another 7 there, and 5. And we're going to use this to then go deeper and break down our riff. So if we add all this up, what do we get? Well, we get 21 between the 7s, extra 10. This is going to equal 31 16th notes. That's an interesting number, because 32 16th notes is going to give us a nice set of 2 full measures. So this is just short of 2 measures, which means it doesn't line up. So we're going to have to do something about that. And I think those kind of riffs that you hear Meshuggah do, and Animals as Leaders, and all these bands that really are in the gent scene, Periphery, etc., they all do this, where they use an odd number that doesn't quite line up, and then somewhere along the line they'll throw in an extra rhythm, or take an extra beat out or something to make it all align. And it creates very interesting polyrhythms. So this is going to be our base structure for our riff, layer number 1. The second step is to break down our large groupings into smaller groupings of 2s and 3s. All right, now you don't have to break down everything, but we're going to break it down because 2s and 3s are kind of the building blocks of music. You can achieve any number with some combination of 2s and 3s. So looking at these larger groupings, I'm going to start just breaking them down into something, fairly intuitive. I'm not going to think too much about it, just to see what we get. Now what we do with these 2s and 3s is going to be kind of like one of those compositional choices that we get to in a minute. But for now, just having this kind of like smaller structure of the rhythm is going to allow us to make some decisions at the micro level, so we can start to have some control over the kind of individual elements within our riff. So now we have 2 layers. We have our overarching rhythmic layer on top, and then the breakdown of those larger rhythms into smaller rhythms that we can then mess with. So next, what I want to do is decide how I use this second layer. This is going to be where a divergence happens between different composers and musicians, because what you do with this is up to your own creativity and your own ability level and how far outside the box you can think. For now, again, I'm not going to stretch too far, and I want to keep it relatively basic. So I'm going to treat each of these 2s and 3s as a new strike of a note. Now, you might want to treat some of them as rests in your own composition. You might want to break some of these down further into maybe little gallop rhythms, or maybe 30-second note speed bursts, or you may want to regroup some of these to be larger, longer note values. So for example, you could combine the 3 and the 2 back together to create a 5 inside the 7 and have a longer note. But for now, we're just going to go for kind of like a very standard gent metal feel, and I'm just going to create a new note for each of these strikes, which means we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 pitches, or 13, I should say 13 new notes that we're going to play within each rhythmic cycle. So very cool, we have another odd number. 13 is going to give us some very interesting stuff. Let's move on to layer 3. Layer 3 is going to be our note cycle, so the pitches that we choose to apply to these notes. Now I'm thinking right now, I'm always loving the major 7 interval. It's a very kind of dissonant, crunchy sounding interval, and it's used a lot in djent and meshuggah style metal music. So I'm going to use some major 7 intervals as kind of my material. Okay, I think just something basic like a major 7th starting on fret 3 on the 8th string and fret 1 on the 8th string is going to be good enough for this. Again, I want to keep this material relatively simple because of how much complexity we have in the rhythm. If we add complexity at every layer, it's going to, well, it has an effect and it's cool. It's a legitimate thing to try and to work into your composition. But when we're just trying to make a cool riff that we want to bang our heads to, then we can't necessarily apply maximal complexity at every level. It'll become just way too much for the ears. So a couple of major 7s, which gives us 4 notes. And that is the important thing here. If we continue doing all these crazy odd numbers, we're not going to have that contrast between kind of like a steady rhythm and steady patterns that we can easily hear, and then complex patterns that we can't hear. And that dissonance is what makes these riffs cool, in my opinion. So 4 notes is a very simple number that most people can follow. And then compare that to the rhythmic cycles, people are going to get lost, but there's going to be some sort of kind of like, I know what's happening, but I don't know what's happening. It'll be cool. So I'm just going to label them note 1, note 2, note 3, note 4. So again, because these numbers are not divisible into each other, it's not going to line up. We finish on note number 1, which means the next time we play through this cycle, it'll be note 2. Now, if we go through and write all the repetitions, we're going to see that by the last cycle, we're going to be starting on the 4th note, and then we'll be back to the 1st note again on the 5th cycle. So there's a lot of math, so hopefully we can still see this. We have almost 2 measures going on up here. We are 1/16th note short. If we repeat this 4 times, then that is going to be 8 measures minus 4/16th notes. 4/16 is 1 beat, 1 whole quarter note. So we're 1 quarter note short of making everything line up in a nice 4/4 time signature. So at some point in here, we can figure out how we want to apply this little extra note. Do we want to maybe put just 1 beat of rest at the end of the whole thing? Do we want to put a different beat somewhere? Or do we want to actually include a weird little extra 16th note on each repetition? We'll figure that out when we're actually kind of fleshing it all out on its final form. But for now, this is good to know how it all lines up. Finally, the last layer that we can start to consider to make our riff just very interesting and take it from kind of this intermediate level to the advanced level is to consider the articulation. This means slides, bends, reverse bends. It can be palm muting things. It can be how we phrase it on the guitar. Like, do we play it really high up on the fretboard or do we play it low on the fretboard? We'll have different timbral choices there. And we can start to choose which notes to play in different ways and create, once again, another cycle. So for this one, we're going to keep it, again, relatively simple, because already it might feel like we're getting out of hand. And we're going to do one of the notes bent every 5 pitches. So I'm just going to put a little kind of like dip on every 5th note here. Okay, so the only thing that's left is to figure out what to do with this kind of one missing beat that we have here. I'm inclined just to kind of do the old school meshuggah thing and tag it onto the very end, either as a rest or maybe just a note that's outside of the box. And it will kind of give the listener a little bit of a cue as to where the entire pattern repeats. So we're just going to add in that right at the end, and I'm going to play around to see what I want to do with that. Okay, let's quickly review what we've done. We have a large rhythmic cycle over 16th notes, grouping them into groups of 5, 7, 7, 7, 5. We then broke down those larger groups into 2s and 3s. Next, we wrote out a 4-note pattern, note 1, note 2, note 3, note 4, that repeats 1 note per layer 2 group. Wrote that out. We see that it takes 4 times for it to line up again at note number 1 at the start. And then overlaying that, we've created a little bend every 5 notes. Now I can see here, right at the end, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe we want to add that 5th note to get a bend and just make it a quarter note. And that will be our reset. So we answered that question. My next step is going to be to write this out in notation that I can actually read and mess around with a little bit easier. For me, that's going to be just standard notation. I'm going to write it out with some beams and some actual notes in Guitar Pro, which will be available on my Patreon for free for any of those who want to see that. But if you don't read music, we can also write this kind of stuff out on a Rhythmic Grid. And I want to show you how to do that, just so that you have the tools available to you if you want to kind of write some music but don't have the traditional training. So I'm just going to do some dotted lines every beat. And because we chose 16th notes, I'm going to treat each one of these dots as a 16th note. If we chose 8th notes, we could make one of these an 8th note. If we chose triplets, we could group them to 3s, but 16th notes, groups of 4. So if you want, you can use multiple sheets, or you can go all the way to the end. We're just going to start the process so you can see how this works. I am going to draw some lines to divide our 5s and 7s now, some kind of thicker lines. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All lines up. 7 again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just like we already know, we have 1 leftover 16th note. Within those bigger lines, we have 2s and 3s. You can kind of create little scoops to show the 2 and 3 subdivisions. 2, 2, 3, and 2, 3. We have our actual hits of each note starting on each one of those, so we don't really have to draw that in. But then we can draw in which notes are bent. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. Then you could keep going, of course, to draw out the entire riff. Now you don't have to use exactly these symbols, these dotted lines, thick lines, whatever. The point of this Rhythmic Grid is you can use whatever kind of symbolism you like and understand. You can create almost your own music notation system. So hopefully this is of use for those of you who want to use it. All right, so next I'm going to take these, write them out in Guitar Pro into a nice file. I'm going to make some actual note choices, and I'll show you what I end up with. So the tab and the Guitar Pro file are going to be available to my Patreon subscribers. And now that we have that, I'm going to work on it for a little while, see if I can get it up to a tempo that I like. Maybe I'll put some drums under it, and hopefully we'll end up with a kind of cool final result. So a couple of last insights into how I learned that and how I practiced it, and how I ended up at that second version of the riff that you heard in the second half. So when I learned the first half, I really didn't look at the sheet music because that really didn't help me after all. Instead, I use this notation system that I like where there's lines and triangles to represent 2s and 3s. So I'll put it up on the screen now so you can see what I mean. And I just went through the riff playing the 4 notes while following that cycle. Now, for that second riff, I made a few changes that were outside of our rule set that we had started with. And for the most part, it was following my intuition and what I thought I wanted to hear, when I wanted to hear long notes more, when I wanted to hear rests more, etc. To get there, though, I did do a couple of things that kind of followed our rule sets before I just let my intuition take over. So a couple of those things were changing the bending patterns to be 7-5-5-5-7 instead of 5-7-7-7-5, so I kind of inverted the numbers there. That ended up being a little too much bending, so I ended up reducing a lot of the bends by the end. I also changed some of the pitches, so we had just 3-4 and 1-2 going on. So instead of that, I created these different cycles when I could see all the bottom notes and the top notes laid out. Instead of just going back and forth between 3 and 1 on the bottom string, I went 3-1-0-2-1. And on the top string, I added some extra notes, a major seventh kind of above where we had those higher notes to create stacks of major sevenths. I also changed the final bar of the whole piece and just did what I thought would be cool, rather than trying to continue following the rules, just so it had a more logical ending. Next, I did some octave displacement, so I brought some notes up the octave, some notes down the octave, so that's why it doesn't really relate to the exact pattern anymore. And then by the end, this is kind of where I let my intuition take over, and I just changed notes that I felt like, and I made some longer, connecting them, made some shorter, I even just added a note here and there. So all that to say, these are some tools that hopefully can start you off composing some riffs or some pieces, but don't let the layers and the rules that you start with prevent you from just making creative decisions later on. The idea of it is to just get you going in your writing process, and then once you are going, at any point you are allowed to just follow your ear. And I actually highly recommend you follow your ear, because if you don't, and everybody just follows rule sets to compose, then everybody's pieces are going to sound the same. So that's it for today's video. I hope it gives you a cool place to start writing some riffs for those of you who are interested in composing a little bit on the 8 string. Lots of things to think about here. Feel free to let me know down in the comments any questions you might have or any other composition tips you may have for other people watching. If you're interested in more conversations with me about composition or just more stuff like this, then feel free to check out my Patreon page. So with all that said, I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a great rest of your day, happy holidays, and as always, happy practicing.